Good afternoon, everyone. Hi. Thanks for joining us today, Santa Clara City Library Comic-Con. My name is Travis Lucina. I am from the Walt Disney Family Museum in San Francisco, located in the Presidio. My title there is Education Studio Manager, which for me is a step up because when I first entered the museum, I was actually called a teaching animator, not an animation teacher, even though that's what I do there. So currently, just a little bit of background on me before we sort of jump into our panel here. I work at the museum right now, and I teach animation and art to students of all ages. I have a team actually at the museum today that's working with 3rd to 5th graders, teaching them stop motion animation, and then part of my team is also there working on concept art with adults and high school kids. I feel very blessed to be a part of the museum because I never thought I would work under any name that had Disney in it. And before I actually sort of went for an interview, I had no idea that the museum itself existed. Why I get into that part of it is because what we're going to talk about today is silent comics. And I write up here telling stories without dialogue. And it's not necessarily even stories without words, but it's much more about stories without dialogue. And a lot of times these kinds of comics actually connect back to animation in some way. And so I'm going to tie that in loosely. This sort of talk that I'm doing is not the exact way to do things. It is a way to approach telling comics silently, sort of my own personal love of that, and then how we actually sort of approach that within the museum. The Walt Disney Family Museum, if you've never been there or if you've never heard of it, it's in the Presidio. You can see the Golden Gate Bridge right behind us. We are a museum dedicated to Walt Disney's life. It is about actually sort of preserving the life and times of what Walt did and actually getting the word out there in some way that he was a person. A lot of times people come up to us and they know the word Disney, and they don't think of the Walt part, and they say, oh, yeah, I think I've heard of Walt Disney, and we're like, do you know he was an actual person? And it's usually younger students and kids, and they're like, no, I had no idea. And it's actually sort of looking at him as a man and a real person that had, failures in life and as well as the successes, obviously. The museum itself was started by Diane Disney Miller, Walt's daughter. She passed away a few years ago. I never got to meet her, unfortunately. But the museum, while I work for the museum is actually run by Walt's family. Diane's husband, Ron Miller, is there. Their kids are on the board. So it's actually the family part of the museum is the Walt Disney family. And a lot of times people don't sort of, again, know that. They think, oh, going to the Walt Disney Family Museum, this is Disneyland, obviously. We're getting on rides, we're going on, touring around that way. It's a beautiful museum, though. And I say that not simply because I work there. When I went through, I was blown away because of the care and the honesty and just the love that's actually in there, because it's dedicated to telling Walt's story. It's actually going from his birth to his death. In there, though, the connection that we're talking about not only is the animation piece, but the fact is the museum itself is this living, breathing story. And story is a major part of what Walt talked about. It's a major part of what Disney Studios talks about now. It's what Pixar talks about. It's in comics. And so it actually tells this story of this person. It is not a place that you can sort of go through and sort of look at it the way you want to look at it. It's also this tale that's being told, and we find that very important. And I constantly sort of bring myself back to that to say, what is the story that's being told, and what is my story while I'm here? There is this connection of animation and comics. And I think a big part of that is when animation started, it was silent. You weren't getting dialogue. You weren't getting people talking. You weren't sort of having these long, deep conversations. You were hearing maybe some music that was played in the theater you went to, or you would just sort of watch it silently. And the animators at that time sort of had to pick up tricks and develop principles, actually, that said, how can I tell a story without somebody talking like I'm talking right now? And so they looked at a lot of different things, and those things actually sort of relate back to comics. And I say that because this isn't about animation versus comics or dialogue versus no dialogue. It's about how you take all of those things and walk through the process that means something to you. Jumping back a little bit, for myself, I've always been into animation, I've always been into art. When I was a kid, I was an introvert, and I still am. I was very, very shy. I did a lot of observation. I still make sure to sit in the back when I'm in a theater like this. And so now I still have that sort of quiet sense of myself, but I get up here and I talk in front of people that I don't know virtually every day, and I meet with kids, and I meet with parents and adults, and I have to put myself out there. When I was a kid, though, having that sort of silent part of myself, that part that said I don't have to speak necessarily, I don't have to sort of just put words out there to put them out there, was a part of my identity. And when I started looking at silent comics, I gravitated towards them, and I still do. Whenever I see a comic that doesn't tell or doesn't use words to tell its story, I sort of give it a different looking over before, you know, probably purchasing it. So within this panel as well, within, I guess it's not a panel, it's me, within the presentation here, you're going to see some things from Disney, you're going to see some things from other artists. The examples that I'm showing up here, you know, I don't own any of these things, but they're things that mean something to me, or they come from books that I've purchased, or you know, art that I follow in some way, or at least have donated to, so that I, you know, because I don't want to just bring anything here. It's something that actually means something to me. Real quick, looking at comics, there was an artist who once wrote this little piece about these Disney comics, these Mickey Disney comics, and this is totally a tangent here. And Floyd Gottfredson, who illustrated and wrote these pieces, he, at a certain point in his career, made Mickey or everybody just sweat profusely, and it was in virtually every single panel you saw somebody sweating or shooting sweat off of them, and it was this like constant state of worry and moisture going on. And I just always found that fascinating, and anytime I sort of get into comics, especially Disney comics, if you pick up any of the Mickey Mouse like giant books, it's in there, and I just love it because I go, what? Everybody is just freaking out. In talking about comics, understanding comics, Scott McCloud, if you have read it, you know it. If you haven't, you should check it out. I think there are lots of great books out there about writing comics, about understanding how comics works. I feel like this is a must-read. I think if you're somebody that's approaching comics at any age and you want to know more about them, read what Scott McCloud has to talk about. I think you should put it in your library. I think it deserves it. It's a fascinating read, and my memory of it always is that it's like a traditional book, but it is a full comic book. And he talks about all sorts of ways to approach comics, and you know, he even goes back to sort of the idea, which other people do too, like, you know, maybe comics start with cave paintings or hieroglyphs in some way, and these things that didn't have words but had to convey information to people. And granted, the culture may have changed, and something that was up there is not necessarily believed or lost to the times or something like that, but it was some way to record that and say, look, we're not just simply going to write, we're also going to have some visual component with that. In this, I'm gonna talk about these four sort of areas in silent comics, and its story, its silhouette and gesture, and its timing. And this isn't the only way to approach it. It's the way that I look at it and say, I think these are really important for people to observe and understand, and even if you're looking at comics in general, with words, to think about how these things actually work together with one another. I can't go on talking about these comics without sort of talking about comics with words in them. And so when you have a comic now, as you hopefully everybody here has read a comic of some kind, you're going to see most of the time these images. You're going to see these characters sort of frozen in time, doing something, looking at someone, having a gesture, and then, you know, creating some sort of voice with their voice balloon or voice bubble, however you word it, and this back and forth between them. And that's something that drives a lot of stories, and it's fabulous. It's this great way to say, look, here is the conversation that's happening, here's the emotion behind it. Voice bubbles, word balloons, they are as much a part of that story as the characters, as the background, as the coloring, as the line work, anything. And they are telling the story as well within that piece. What happens is that, you know, for me, when I started writing comics when I was a kid, I just would I would draw two characters and I would put one on my left and one on my right, and I would have the one on the left and he would be like, I'm doing okay, like, you know, kind of up and down, but, you know, things are kind of rough. And then the guy on the right would be like, hey, how's it going? And then people would read it and be like, what? And it was because I didn't think about the positioning. I didn't think about how the dialogue was supposed to be worded. I didn't think, oh, I read left to right, therefore maybe I should structure this in a certain way. I wasn't thinking about that. I just said, I'm going to put stuff down in a panel. The words within a comic oftentimes can tell you where you're supposed to go. It can structure the story, it can structure your flow, it can structure the tale that you're telling. And the framing, you know, whether or not there are gutters, whether it's a splash page, however it's illustrated, if it's black and white or not, the fact is that when you have dialogue, it's going to push you along. And it's sort of telling you, when you look up here and you look at the difference between these 3 pages, and where these sort of words are popping up, or if there is some sort of narration or some other voice coming into it, or whether or not it's an emphasized word because it's more, you know, harder black or block letters, these things are going to drive you through the story. And, you know, again, tying it back, when we talk about story at the museum, and I'm going to sort of get more into this, we talk about telling the story that you want to tell. And going through that story, but telling the one that you actually want to tell, but telling it the best way that you can. Sometimes you'll get, you know, a page like this that sort of may structure things a little bit differently and say, okay, well, look, you've got the layout is sort of leading you actually down into the bottom right-hand corner, or some people look at this immediately and go, actually, it's leading me out of the bottom right-hand corner. But you can see that the words are put in there, they're sort of stacked, the voice bubbles are sort of actually connected to one another, and in some ways it becomes an overwhelming task to look at this and start to say, okay, how am I going to read this? Usually this is not the first page of the comic. It's something that with any story, you know, you don't just jump in and you go, and then I fell out, and people are like, what are you talking about? And I go, wait, let me back up. Okay. So here I was in the car and I was driving down, and then you go, oh, okay. It's the same thing with any of this. You don't sort of, you can start in the middle of the action, but you actually want your audience to follow along with the story that you're telling. Looking at the addition of this, you know, with these two, this is from Paper Girls, which if you stop by our booth today, there's a woman, Antonia, who turned me on to this comic, and she's like, you gotta read it, you gotta read it. I'm like, okay, I'm starting to pick it up. And I'm like, I'm not so sure. And I'm starting to get into it and going, okay, I'm kind of getting there. And then she's like, I'll lend you copies. So if you stop by and say to Antonia, if you know Paper Girls, say to Antonia, like, I love it. And she'll like talk to you for hours about it. You can see that the art it's here. You've got this close up right on this character, and then it kind of pulls out to these 3 characters with another character where we're kind of looking from their point of view. But the structure, again, is giving you these very simplified word balloons, these very simplified, this font. These are sort of put in there in a way that say, look, okay, we know where they're going to go, and we're going to plan that for our sort of structure of our story. What happens when you don't get to say anything? How do you actually tell that story? How do you actually sort of approach that piece of storytelling? When you have to stop talking, when you just have to say, okay, let me tell you my story, but I'm not going to use any dialogue. You go, how are you supposed to do that? One way in telling your story is to actually sort of go out and write a script. And we did another panel where we talked about writing for comics and ways to approach that. And some people actually write a full-on script of their comic. They lay out every panel. They give the direction. When I write up here, think visually, describe what you see, understand the story you want to tell, and follow it to the end, try again. It's because people, they think visually up here, and they make the movie in their head, and then they don't describe it very well. And we've all either had that moment, again, where we tell a story, or we have that friend that tells that story that leaves out giant gaps of information or locations or something like that, and you go, can we back up a little bit? It's the same thing with your comic, whether there are words or not. But when you don't have the dialogue, when you can't get up there and say, hey, how's it going? Come on over here, I want to show you this thing. Oh, what are you going to show me? Oh, look at this. I found this amazing book. It's got this treasure map hidden inside. And then you go, let's delete all that. How are you going to tell that? Like, are you going to gesture like this? Are you going to have your friend wave? Are they going to walk over? Are they going to show them the book? Are they actually going to pull that out? You have to understand what it is that your story is first. Again, a big part of what I tell my students is I'm not there to teach you a Disney way of animating. I'm not telling you how to animate my way or draw or write or anything. What I'm trying to do is get you to make the story you want to make and tell it the best way that you can. This amazing, thrilling slide that I have up here is from this comic script that I worked on with a friend of mine who writes. His name is Greer Klutz, and I approached him with this idea, and I said, you know, I have sort of this thought of this guy who's kind of going through a breakup, and he ends up talking to these weird sort of monsters. And look, we're live streaming my idea and everything else, and it's going to be gone in like half an hour, right? Somebody's going to make a ton of money off this. But you look at this, and we went through it, and we said, let's script it out. Let's do it. And Greer is like a writer, and so he knows how to take my ideas and flesh them out and actually say, okay, what do we need to sort of do here? And we broke this up and said, we're going to shoot for about 6 panels per page. And in this story, we actually kind of looked at a little bit of dialogue here and there. But you can see this is page 10 or 11. Maybe you can sort of read it, but it's just describing kind of what's going on, and it's telling us when we need to look at this character and when we need to pause, when we need to actually sort of pull in on the character, when there's a close-up of their eyes closing and then their eyes opening and this character revealing that they're in a flower shop. And it's page 10 and 11 of this script that we worked on, and it flashes between the past and the present and sort of this haggard poor man who goes through this breakup. And what his memories are of his girlfriend and meeting her for the first time. This doesn't always appeal to people very well, and it's not always the right way to go about it. You can also sort of just come at this and say, look, visually, this is what's happening. And you could look at this. I could throw this at somebody who says, okay, I have no idea who Snow White is. I don't know what it is. And they could probably say, well, on the first panel on the left here, she's sort of got her hand to her chest, and he's reaching his arms out, and he's either pleading or, begging of some kind, or reaching out for her. But there's care, there's thought, there's a vulnerability to him because he's open like this. And then his body language changes, and he shifts, and he points, and she looks frightened, and she starts to run off. And you can start to get that already with just a couple panels. Your story that you want to tell is the story you want to tell. You have to figure that out. If you look at these 2-3 panel comics, it's just kind of this idea of, look, you've got a character, they're at a barbecue or whatever, the smoke's hitting their face, they run off, you can see the back of the car just a little bit, and then you come in and you go, oh, look, it's this like snorkel showing up. Or here's Goofy like doing what Goofy does, and oh, the picture's upside down, I'll just get on top of the camera and flip myself upside down. That's how I'll view it. But there's that gag, and you start to understand, look, you don't need somebody to say, oh man, the smoke is in my eyes, or oh, the camera is upside down, what should I do? Or I know, I'll go off and do this. Anybody who's taken a writing class with any good writing teacher will tell you to, show, not tell. And it's really important to remember that. In your comic form, it's especially important to remember that. I brought up a couple things. I went back to when I was in college, and I put up this here where I originally had done this sort of as, I started making this comic about my storyboarding class. And then I was like, I'm actually going to turn this as a storyboard, where it flows more like a comic, though. And so if you look, I kind of went back and then numbered these, but you've got page 1, and you're pulling in on this room, and then or panel 1. Panel 2 is this over the shoulder shot of this character who's me, like sitting at my computer, and then there's this close up of my computer, and it's saying my assignment of my storyboarding. Panel 4 is me just kind of looking at that like, okay. 5, I kind of do this like, you know, breath out, and then I turn, you know, over, and I look back at the deadly blank page sitting across the room from me. And this was about me making a comic. And so I look at it, and again, it pulls out, and it says, here are your enemies. Here's Travis, and here's the art desk. I then walk up, and I'm sort of hand behind my head, scratching it, looking at this blank page. I turn on the light because obviously I need more light. You know, sort of again, still facing this fear of this blank page. I sit down, pencil in hand, and I draw my first box. I draw my first panel here. I then kind of, you look at it and go, I'm not really sure what to do. You know, showing the panel, showing the pencil, again, showing hopefully there's some sort of fight going on between me and this thing. This book is winning. You know, a little more frustration in my face, and then I just throw my pencil up in the air, close the book, and I go off and play video games, which is how I approached a lot of my assignments in art school. And I just did it, and I said, you know, I'm going to just tell this personal story to me, and it doesn't have to be something that I put out there for everybody, but when I approach it, I'm going to say, look, I don't need to tell everybody what I'm thinking or what I'm feeling. I'm going to let them sort of figure that out within the story, but I'm going to at least sort of put some notes to myself to say, look, I want this to happen, or I think this is what the tension is supposed to be, whether anybody gets that or not. In that, you think about telling your story, and there are ways to approach it. This is a very personal way for me, is that I think about when I am going to tell my comic book story, or when I recommend this, or I actually do this with students where, and I do this in virtually every class that I have that's an extended class. I go through this guided narrative with them, and I actually walk them through this story where I say, okay, I want you to close your eyes, and I sit down, and everybody closes their eyes and they get set, and I say, okay, you're in this room, and slowly the room starts to fade away and it starts to get black, and then light starts to pick up, and I do this over, you know, much slower than I'm doing now, and you wake up and you're within these sort of woods, and you start walking forward, and you can actually feel the coolness of the air around you. It's on your skin. Maybe you're barefoot, maybe you're not. Each step, maybe you're hearing the mud squish beneath your feet, or you're feeling the crunch of leaves, and you can feel the branches around you, and you look around. And I walk them through this narrative. Telling your story in a different point of view can sometimes actually sort of help you get away from the words and the dialogue that need to be in there. So when you do it, you can enter the first person and say, I was in the middle of the forest, and I began to walk through the dense brush. When I tell stories like that, when I say that to people, my next sentence usually is, this is what I was thinking, this is what I was saying. You know, I thought to myself, man, am I ever going to get out of here? The first person for me doesn't work as well. You can go to third person and say, you know, she could hear the sounds of small insects and the crunching of the ground beneath her feet, right? And you could sort of remove yourself for a second. I prefer looking at this second person way of working. And it suddenly takes away all the speech for me personally. You reach out to touch the leaves and branches as you pass by. Looking up, you see patches of sunlight through the trees. Never have I told a you story where I put words in someone's mouth. And that helps me when I actually go out to say, there's no dialogue in this. When I remove those other pieces, and it's not for everybody, but it's just a personal trick for me. When I say it's you, suddenly I'm giving you the actions, but I'm not necessarily giving you all the thoughts that you're having. Where the first and third for me feel like I am dictating everything about what you're thinking and what you're feeling. Ileana Serdukan, or Serdukan, I haven't heard her name pronounced out loud, but she does some beautiful illustrations. She does some beautiful comics here. This is this one, you know, a game of hide and seek, where we look at how she tells the story of this girl building a snowman, and this boy in this sort of, you know, cat hoodie is in the woods, and how they discover each other, and how she pulls him in and says, hey, join my friends and look at what we're doing. When you look at this, you could have oh, hey, what's going on? Oh, hey, why don't you come out here? Hey, everybody, come on. Hey, look who I found. You could add all of that. It doesn't need any of that. It's bringing you in a different way. we look at stories sometimes also at the Walt Disney Family Museum, and we use this tool called the Story Spine, which was developed by a playwright named Ken Adams. And I think it's brilliant to begin anybody who wants to sort of write a longer, bigger epic. It has this format to it, this once upon a time, every day, but one day, because of that, because of that, because of that, until finally, and ever since then. And you can do this with friends, you can do this as a game, you can actually sort of, once upon a time there was a man named Travis, and he was sitting up at a Comic-Con panel. Every day he sweated profusely like a Mickey Mouse comic. But one day he decided to, and you can fill this thing out in your own way and give you a larger story. You can apply this to movies, you can apply this to comics, you can apply this to other books. What's important to know, though, is that this is a starter, and this is not something that you should use ever for like a 3-panel comic, for instance. The everyday isn't probably going to be told in there. I suggest looking at something like, what is your beginning, middle, and end? Breaking it down really simply and understanding, what is the size of your story that you want to tell? And if it's very, very large and you're going to encounter all these places where you need talking, how are you going to get around that if you approach that? Maybe it's a written word on a box or something, but the length of it. This is also from Bone, which I say is also a must-read if you've never read it, by Jeff Smith. I think it's a fabulous book.
Check it out from the library.
Yeah, there you go. Moving into the silhouette, I put this image up here, and I get this range of adults and kids who are like, I know that one. I have no idea who that is, from both sides. And, there are lots of people who are like, of course I know who, Charlie Brown is. And somebody else is like, Hey Arnold, like, yeah. Pinky and the Brain, right? There's one up there, this sort of next to Snoopy on the sort of the right, next to Olive Oil, that most people are kind of like, what am I even looking at? Which is Mojo Jojo from Powerpuff Girls. And then other people are like, I'm sorry, what did you just say to me? But identifying characters, this was a big principle within animation, is saying, like, look, if you have a strong silhouette, you can understand who that character is immediately, and you start to look at their actions. Within that, Disney had these sort of rules that said, look, you're going to tell your story with your actions outside of the character. Never are you going to take Jiminy Cricket eating an ice cream, which I'm kind of like, what size ice cream is that? Like, he's a cricket. But he's never going to pull it in like this, right? If I'm going to illustrate me here, I'm not going to illustrate it like this. I'm going to try not to fall off the stage, right? If I'm going to actually illustrate it, I'm probably going to have it out here like this, or I'm going to have it in this arm like this and holding it out, and maybe doing something like that, so that it's clear what the gesture is, so that it's clear that I'm gesturing to the group, so that it's clear that I'm going back to my computer. They developed these rules. Looking at that within comics is great, and you can take that with so many comics and actually sort of, there's a fun little trick activity where you could actually sort of print out one or get a Sunday newspaper and like take a Sharpie over the characters and just obliterate them, and if you can still tell what they're doing, it's great. That's really strong storytelling in gesture. Model sheets are also another way. This is not necessarily a traditional model sheet, but getting some sketches out of what do your characters look like when they're happy? What do they look? Well, these two are always happy in everything they do, ever. Digging a hole? Who doesn't love that? But they are just, at least you know what it looks like when they're digging that hole, or when they're sort of saying hello, or when they're running off, or when they're reading a book. Like, actually doing some sketches for yourself to say, hey, this is what my character looks like. In a silent comic, it's going to become very clear how that character reacts for you as the author or the writer, even if you haven't developed a full character description or sheet for that character. You're going to actually know who they are really quickly, whether they're an angry type or not, or a happy person or a sad person or something like that. There are these other sorts of rules about how you structure fingers within Disney, or how again, the posture, looking at line of action. These are all things that you can sort of look at in art classes. There are great resources out there everywhere that talk about posture, gesture, silhouette. If you're not thinking that way, gesturally, it's hard because then you sometimes get to this area that says, hey, look, we're just standing there. And I love Bob's Burgers, by the way. I really do. And the thing that when I'm working with animation, I have to tell people that I love these shows. They're not necessarily animated the best as some other things out there. And people go, how dare you? And I go, well, no. What I mean is there are lots of scenes where these people are talking to one another, but there's not a lot of animation happening. Their mouth is moving, or they maybe move an arm up here or there. But I'm not talking about the artwork or the color or the scene or the writing, the animation, the sort of gesture. This doesn't mean, though, that that is bad. An artist that I really love who, his stories look very, very simplistic, but are actually probably directed more toward adults than they are for kids. Sorry, kids. Is this guy named Jason. And he is probably my favorite comic book artist. And he tells both stories with words and without. And the way that he approaches timing in his story is sort of that last piece of this, which is, I'm going to sort of talk about timing within this, but he doesn't always have the greatest, gesture or silhouette going on. But the way that he approaches these moments in time, I savor. And this is not me saying this is what he does. This is how I view these things. Timing in comics is really hard because you don't get to tell people how long they look at that piece of paper. A movie can stretch a scene out as long as they want to stretch it out, or hold that shot and you're going, this is so long. They haven't cut away. What's going on? A comic, you're like, buildings, guy standing, looking, oh, there's a kid, oh, it's over the shoulder, they're looking down at each other, turn the page. It doesn't mean you don't get much from that, but you don't get to control it. So when you change your sort of timing and you stretch something out like this, as long as you want to stretch it out and make sure that they are making eye contact and then they are still making eye contact, that's gonna tell the timing that you want your audience to think about within that story. He does, really sort of sometimes mundane little pieces or parts of his story. I love this bus stop one because it's just this guy sort of sitting at the bus waiting. I also love this restaurant scene because it begins with this couple eating, and then it cuts to this waiter, and then we're focused on the waiter, and it shows him walking to the kitchen, and you go, oh, how wonderfully boring is that? And then it cuts to this guy washing dishes, and you go, wait, who is the focus of this story? Is it the couple? Is it the waiter? Is it the dishwasher? Is it all of them? His timing says, look, we want you to enjoy the meal. We want you to know what it's like to be the waiter, to take the stuff to the back. And we want you to know what it's like to be in the back actually washing those dishes. Here's a clever way that he got around some dialogue of this kid in school hearing the incredible, boring teacher talking to him and him drawing Batman, was that he just put up some text and he just inserted it in there, and you look at it and you immediately go, of course, I don't want to hear any of that. Sarah Varon is another artist. I love her book, especially Robot Dreams, all silent about this dog who purchases a robot. One thing she does in here is that she tells the words with voice bubbles, but with imagery inside of it. She really sort of has a simplistic way of sort of her art, but also her tale that she's telling. The timing in here, when these two enter this apartment and put on an apron and start cooking, together, you feel that. You get the sense. You hear the water boiling. You know what the cupboards sound like opening. You can get the sense that this is going to take a little bit of time to sort of put this stuff together and cook it. This shot then on the right with this robot sitting within the snow, that's telling timing in a different way. They don't need to show like the entirety of it actually getting covered over 16 pages or something like that. It's going to show it in 3 panels. The same thing here with the timing of they're at the beach, she has a backpack on, suddenly she's in the water. Timing is so different, but then it slows down for this robot, because if I'm a robot, I saw it, I'm not going swimming. I, at one point, did, just to jump back, because I want to, I put my stuff out there as much as I can because I think it's important not to hide my stuff. Not that I think everything I do is brilliant, but I love my mistakes as well. I always tell every student, you have a sketchbook, don't cross things out, don't scribble them. I don't care if you erase, but live with your mistakes, live with your failures. It's also something Walt said was really important. I, at one point, a few years ago, was doing this comic a day for myself, and the challenge was 6 panels, And some of them had words, some of them had dialogue, some didn't. This is this character waiting, you know, on the phone call, hanging up, sitting on his couch, ding dong, you know, pizza shows up. And that was it. And that was my story. One is him just sort of daydreaming about who he could be. This one was sort of inspired by maybe some of my afternoons at some point, and sitting on the couch, and the friend shows up and go, hey, I love it, and let's go to the coffee shop, and oh my god, let's write a song and make music. We should totally draw in the park. Hey, let's play more video games. And it's like, okay, see ya, and then it's left with, oh. It's just back to what it was without that. A few artists worth noting, sort of before I wrap this up, and there are lots of them. Again, if you want to swing by our booth, you can totally talk to us about this. Mark Tutuli, who does Leo, these wonderfully dark but innocent comics. I think they're so special, and when I read it, I was like, yep, you speak my language. We're from the same planet at somewhere. It tells about this innocent little boy who does these sort of sometimes not innocent little things, but these weird things that happen in his world. Jim Woodring, who his comics again are probably more suited for an older audience, very surreal, very weird, but so great without dialogue. I got to meet him a few years ago, and he was a fabulous person to talk to and pick his brain. But he is a huge inspiration to me personally because of the way that he does timing, the way that he is not afraid to show somebody laying there with their eyes closed and then their eyes opening in the same position and then getting up. Shantan, or Shantan, as he says, you can pronounce either way. This book I know is in the library for sure. You should totally check it out. This is The Arrival. It's gorgeous. It is kind of a little bit not about what it seems, but there are no words in here. It's kind of about maybe some immigration and things like that, maybe a war. But you should look at this because of the way that he goes about sort of saying, look, I'm bringing you into this world and how you are taken through this journey. In all of this, if you're looking at any of this, tell the story that you want to tell. Go at it, and if you want to challenge yourself to do something with no words, you know, you can. I'll pick this up for 1 second. We know certain gestures that everybody does, right? If I'm walking like this and I'm crossing the room and I go, bye. Most of you are going to look at that and go, oh, he probably picked up a coin or a button or something. Nobody's going to be like, oh, what kind of weird pair of scissors did he pick up off the floor or something, right? You know from what I'm doing, and you know because you've probably done it. Bringing in things from your life is really good. And the last piece is this. You know, I've got some cameras on me and stuff right now. Don't be afraid to get your friend, well, my phone's up there, and say, hey, can you take some pictures of me as reference doing some ridiculous stuff for my comics so that you can actually get some gestures of you. And looking at it and seeing you doing it, there's no rule that says you can't sort of draw over those things. I'm so attracted to the way that silent comics work because they bring me in and I connect with them in a different way, not a better way, but a different way with the story, because I'm projecting my thoughts into those characters and I linger not based on what is said, but based on what I'm seeing. So thank you for coming today. I appreciate you guys.